And so we come to the Legion I was most concerned about when I began this undertaking, for the simple reason of their mysterious nature. This Legion, even since its birth, has been a shady one, and the Legion's Primarch was one of the few, if not the only one, that was not recruited directly by the Emperor. Actually, I can't even say Primarch singular, since it's in fact Primarchs in this one rare case. One of the most flexible forces in the Great Crusade, this Legion was often called into disrepute by their brothers due to their unorthodox strategies. The Legion and its Primarchs both turned traitor during the Horus Heresy, though just like practically everything else involving this slot, there's a large debate as to their true reasons and even whether they fell to chaos at all. Today they are scattered, but seemingly not shattered like many other traitor legions, its forces forming small autonomous warbands with their Primarchs seemingly dead or at the very least lost. Officially, they were the 20th Legion Astartes led by their Primarch Alpharius and Omegon, though in truth Alpharius and Omegon were entirely separate individuals. In contrast to their designation as the last of the legions, they are known as the Alpha Legion, and this is what we can piece together of their story. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to Legions, a 40k Stories mini-series. The 20th Legion were founded during the Unification Wars, though like the Salamanders and Space Wolves, they were seemingly created in isolation from the others. Official records state that they were founded later, only a few decades before their Primarchs showed up, but the Legion was probably around much longer than that and simply kept secret by the Emperor. I suspect that many in both the Imperium and the Legion as Astartes themselves would be forgiven for not even knowing there was a 20th Legion, as even once they were deployed, they did not fight in a conventional manner. Rather than present a united force with perhaps unorthodox tactics, as would be much more the case later on, the 20th were kept in the dark, only around 1 to 2,000 strong for reasons unknown. A Gene C defect was suspected, but this never reared its head in future, so I find it unlikely. They were, in essence, a Black Ops task force, though whether they were mostly unified or split into smaller cells is slightly unclear. They bore no heraldry, even going so far as to disguise themselves in the colours of their brother legions on occasion, and would often carry out missions such as abduction, sabotage, and assassination. This is not to say that they could not fight more conventionally, far from it, but even when their forces were committed en masse, they would strike from all sides in a unique attack they called the Harrowing. If there were ever a legion that embodied the principles of death by 1,000 cuts, it would probably be the 20th over even the White Scars and Raven Guard. There was one other trend that became apparent quickly when the 20th was around: no witnesses. I suspect this was mainly to ensure that word of the Legion's existence didn't get out to either side of the Great Crusade, but it didn't stop the rumours from growing of a Ghost Legion. If anyone did have any questions or complaints, they were swiftly rebuked, and the Ghost Legion perhaps became even more mythical. I'm sure plenty of you are curious as to the name of the Legion, or at least the one it would take eventually, as it bears no resemblance to their future heraldry or their role. I know I was confused for a while. As far as we can tell, it was due to their designations in the Unification Wars and early Great Crusade. Units of the Hidden 20th were simply designated Alpha. Others suspect it was something else entirely, that the Proto-Legion stage of gene seed implantation, known as the Alpha stage, was the last the 20th received due to their limited size. Proto-Legions were not sanctioned for mass implantation yet, effectively capping their numbers. Others still suggest it was a mockery of them being the last Legion revealed, or that it was a statement of intent in combination with the Omega and Hydra symbols they often used. As has already become a running trend that will frustratingly continue, likely we will never truly know. Since the 20th fell out of the records and operated in the shadows / as members of other legions, the battlefields they fought on this period are a total mystery, but eventually there came a time where they could no longer be hidden. It may have been that the Great Crusade required another frontline legion, dictating that the 20th were brought into the light, or that they were simply no longer needed due to other organizations filling their roles. But the most likely reason was the eventual rediscovery of their Primarch, the last of the Emperor's sons to be found, Alpharius and Omegon. There are many conflicting tales concerning the discovery of Alpharius and Omegon, Lord of Serpents, henceforth simply known as Alpharius, since Omegon was of course an entirely separate individual. The most commonly accepted tale is that the 20th Primarch was scattered amongst the stars like his brothers, though none truly know where he landed, as he was not found on a planet. Rather, at some time during the Crusade before the triumph of Ptolemy, Horus Lupercal and the Lunar Wolves found themselves under attack from an enemy fleet. After crippling an Imperial ship and then ambushing their pursuers, this force was defeated, but a lone or small group of individuals was able to board what is believed to have been the Vengeful Spirit, since that was Horus's flagship in later times, and make their way to the bridge. When they arrived, they slew the Astartes that attacked with ease, and it's said that the battle ended only once he and the future War Master got a look at each other, recognizing the situation and supposedly causing Horus to laugh. He'd found his last brother Primarch. Horus then kept Alpharius with him in secret from an unknown period of time, trying to find the world Alpharius had come from, but his brother denied that every planet they visited was his. Eventually, the last Primarch journeyed to meet the Emperor, and after a period of great celebration, he was given the 20th Legion to command. However, this tale is a lie. An alternate version of events suggests that Alpharius landed on an unknown dead planet, completely alone. He found his way to the stars after a Corsair ship came to try and plunder the ruins of whatever this world had been. Alpharius killed the degenerate humans in Xenos before seeking out his maker and eventually finding the Emperor. This is also a lie. A further variant of Alpharius' origins would perhaps be more closely aligned with the other Primarchs in a way, in that the Emperor sought them out and brought them into the Crusade. This tale states that the Lord of Serpents had been the sole survivor of an attack by the Xenos known as Sloth, and only a Primarch could hope to resist them. He was brought as something as a slave or experiment until the Emperor arrived. Everyone else was dead. Like every other account, and the one suggesting that Alpharius wasn't scattered like the Primarchs but instead remained with the Emperor in secret, this is a lie. Therefore, despite any evidence, circumstantial or otherwise, there is no known true account of how Alpharius came to be reunited with his legion, which, whilst irritating for historians and chroniclers such as myself, is perfectly in character for the 20th Primarch. As for Omegon, the twin Primarch will almost certainly have been wherever Alpharius was before their return to the Imperium. He was just too similar to his brother to have been a separate Primarch, such as the lost 2nd or 11th, and had he been found separately, he'd likely have been given some other command or duty instead. In terms of appearance, Alpharius and Omegon were completely identical, and whilst Alpharius was the public face of the pair, it is known that they would switch who took on that role, not that anyone other than the two of them would possibly know. However, like many twins, physical similarity does not dictate mental ones, as it's known that Alpharius and Omegon did not see eye to eye on everything, but we'll discuss that in more depth a little later. Despite their differences, any who knew of Omegon's existence described the twins as being almost linked, with more than one describing them as a single soul in two bodies. Using this argument, one could actually attempt to explain their differences of opinion, and we know soul-splitting is a thing that can occur, though I only recall it happening with psychics such as Magnus the Red, and neither Alpharius nor Omegon were believed to be psychic themselves. Whatever the circumstances of their creation or return, Alpharius and Omegon, after a fashion, were given command of the 20th Legion, which assumedly was officially renamed to the Alpha Legion as they came out of the shadows themselves, and took to the battlefields of the Great Crusade. The tactics of the Alpha Legion, while seemingly impossible for many to understand, were reliant on the incredible skill and flexibility of all involved in executing them. Formations were temporary, at best, reconfigured by Alpharius or other commanders from battle to battle, even within the same campaign. This almost fluid structure made the 20th nigh impossible to predict or engage, and on the rare occasions that they waged open war, it was easy to make analogies to the Hydra symbol they had officially taken in their multi-pronged lethal attacks that even Horus and Sanguinius begrudgingly commended. Truth be told, it was rare for such battles to take place, as the pre-Alpharius mastery of espionage and infiltration was highly utilised and second to none. Training for the Alpha Legion was said to be done at a squad level as opposed to an individual one, creating unparalleled cohesion and allowing the Legion to adapt easily to their commander's needs. One of the first recorded battles to involve Alpharius showed clearly that the Lord of Serpents was as devious as any other, the event known as the Hunting of the Ak-Hyreth, a parasitic Xenos race that had survived attempted exterminations from both the Lunar Wolves and Night Lords. The Alpha Legion repeated the actions of their brothers, and as before, the Ak-Hyreth fled to rebuild in secret. But rather than assume a job well done, Alpharius left a trap. The Primarch commissioned and then deployed a bioweapon that would wipe the Xenos out, but rather than seed the worlds they might hide on, Alpharius chose to poison the human populace he knew the Ak-Hyreth would feed on when they returned. It killed or infected around 7% of the people and condemned them to death in the long run as essentially live bait, but it ensured the Ak-Hyreth's total extinction. We can almost guarantee that Alpharius was the one to commission this, as Omegon was believed to have cared more about civilian casualties than his more callous twin. The idea of victory through subtlety or subterfuge was almost if not completely universal in the Alpha Legion's fragmented history, but unsurprisingly, not everyone in the Great Crusade was as on board with the idea. The deserved martial pride of the 20th brought them into conflict with the Death Guard for some reason. There was nearly open conflict with the Imperial Fists, only stopped by the Emperor, and Conrad Kurz is believed to have said they hide their true sins in a shroud of lies, though what he was implying is slightly more open to interpretation. For reasons unknown, the Thousand Sons also quietly shunned the Alpha Legion, even though Alpharius was believed to be supportive of Psychus despite not being in Nicaea. I assume the seers had foreseen or witnessed something, but I can't back that up. We've already noted there was a slight begrudging acceptance from Sanguinius and Horus, but it is known that the Alpha Legion were able to work without incident alongside the Lunar Wolves as well as the Iron Hands and Dark Angels. By contrast, Robert Guilliman hated Alpharius by the end of the Great Crusade, and it is likely that said hatred stems from the Tactica compliance sometime after Ullanor. What was probably slated as a routine joint compliance operation was, in true Alpha Legion fashion, anything but. Guilliman co-planned and then began to harry and constrict the enemy forces in space, but the 20th's attacks were seemingly random, and Guilliman was recorded as demanding Alpharius place his forces under his command to speed things along. Alpharius declined, and shortly after launched a full-on assault against Testra Prime, but decided to let them reinforce their defences for a full week before attacking. Shocking no one, the invasion was an incredible success, and the Alpha Legion struck from within and without from every side, winning a decisive victory before withdrawing and letting the riots they incited finish the job. Testra Prime fell only a few days later, and the tactic was repeated more than once during the campaign, but when Guilliman questioned why he'd chosen such a roundabout and perhaps even cruel method instead of doing things the usual way, Alpharius supposedly replied that it would have just been too easy. Suffice it to say that the 13th Legion's lord was more than a bit angry with his brother, and the two never worked together again. In fact, most of the Primarchs were unimpressed with Alpharius for what happened to Testra. Only Horus is known to have commended him. Horus was probably the only true friend Alpharius had amongst his brothers, though that's possibly still a bit of a stretch. Toward the end of the Great Crusade, the Alpha Legion seemingly headed back toward the shadows in a metaphorical sense, operating right at the fringes of Imperial space, but it is believed that the 20th had agents across the Imperium and possibly even embedded with other Legion Astartes. At the time of the Istvan compliance and the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, it is believed they were around 120,000 strong, but potentially were much larger. The fall of Alpharius and Omegon is perhaps the greatest piece of manipulation the Alpha Legion ever pulled off. A simple glance at their choice to betray would conclude that the good treatment Horus showed to Alpharius would have helped convince him, even though it is unknown if the Lord of Serpents had any issue with the Emperor or wider Imperium, but the truth is far subtler. Around 2 years before the heresy was revealed, a secretive Xenos organization known as the Cabal contacted the Primarchs of the 20th Legion and told them that in order to defeat Chaos once and for all, Horus needed to succeed in his rebellion. An Imperial win would preserve humanity, but ultimately see Chaos consume the galaxy. And to be honest, they may be right. It is believed that Alpharius went along with the request of the Cabal to aid Horus. If true, this means that the Alpha Legion never fell to Chaos, but were instead fighting for the good of the galaxy. However, there is also evidence suggesting there was a rift of sorts between the brothers on the correct course of action, as evidenced in some outright confusing decisions taken by Alpha Legion forces throughout the heresy. Alpharius and around 50,000 Alpha Legionaries were committed on Istvan V, fighting primarily Salamanders and Imperial Army forces once their betrayal was revealed and the drop site massacre began. In the aftermath, a force of the 20th actually destroyed a World Eater's ship, allowing the Raven Guard under Corax to escape from the Sons of Angron, and it is suspected that this was done to allow infiltrators in disguise to leave with the Raven Lord's forces. These infiltrators were later reinforced by others that potentially included Omegon, and between them they were able to both taint and steal the gene seed/data for the newly developed Raptors, causing massive mutation that forced Corax to kill them all post-heresy. The data itself was passed on to Fabius of the Emperor's Children on the orders of Horus, but it is known that the copy Omegon passed on was incomplete and borderline useless, meaning the apothecary would never succeed whilst the Alpha Legion had the good stuff, though it's unknown if they've actually ever done anything with it. Elsewhere, the Alpha Legion were tasked with recruiting the White Scars to the traitor course in the Chondak system, but rather than follow this order, the 20th blockaded Jagtai Khan and his sons until word came from Rogul Dawn of the heresy's beginning. It is believed that Omegon instigated the destruction of a jamming array held by the Alpha Legion in order for the message to get through. The final known major Primarch level engagement for the Alpha Legion was the Battle of the Alaxes Nebula, sometime between the burning of Prospero and the second battle on the same planet between the White Scars and the Death Guard. The Space Wolves had been ambushed by the Alpha Legion after their battles with the Thousand Suns and were now recovering, when Alpharius and his forces arrived to try and finish them off. Jagtai Khan reluctantly chose not to aid the Wolves, instead heading to Prospero to discover the truth of the heresy and who was actually the traitor, leaving Russ and his forces to fight for their lives. Despite the prowess of the Wolf King, the 6th Legion would likely have been wiped out by the 20th were it not for the intervention of a Dark Angel Starford that supposedly swore loyalty to Luther as opposed to Lionel Johnson. This was pre-fall, so whilst this force would probably become fallen angels, they were still loyalist at this time. The Alpha Legion were driven off by the combined loyalist force, and though Alpharius and Omegon didn't appear much again until the final chapters of the Heresy, the 20th was still operating across much of the galaxy. For example, a force masquerading as Aenid Theo and his Ultramarines came close to assassinating Robbie Gilliman, and it's likely that any other embedded agents in the other legions were causing their own forms of trouble on both sides. If you hadn't noticed yet, it was rather apparent that the Alpha Legion was at least partially divided in loyalty, as noted in the events involving the White Scars at Chondax in particular. Not only did the force not even attempt to recruit Jagtai Khan, as they were asked, but it was manipulations from Omegon himself that helped set the Khan on the path he eventually took. Whilst it's almost impossible to say with any certainty, it's possible that Omegon disagreed with Alpharius' decision to aid the Cabal, even if both were still kind of loyal, and so he attempted to subvert Horus's rebellion with the end goal of ensuring a loyalist victory. As always with the Alpha Legion, the answer will likely never be truly known. The Alpha Legion were the only traitor legion not confirmed as fighting in the Siege of Terra, but they were heavily involved in the solar war that preceded the climax of the heresy. The 20th were responsible for sowing chaos in the Sol system before Horus's arrival there, and so a series of agents orchestrated uprisings on Terra and elsewhere. The main fleet then arrived whilst the defenders led by Dawn were distracted, attempting to take over Pluto's moon of Hydra that housed the vital communications array. Without it, the Imperium would be in the dark as to Pluto's fate. Unfortunately, the force led by Sigismund was able to stall just long enough for reinforcements including Dawn to arrive, and eventually the Praetorian of Terra won out over his brother, slaying Alpharius in combat. It is almost certain that one of the two twin Primarchs died on Hydra, as they spoke of fighting for the future instead of chaos and urged Dawn to join them, and it was probably Alpharius since he was the more public of the pair. Of course, if Alpharius did die, then Omegon will have simply assumed his brother's mantle, and the operations of the Alpha Legion will have continued nonetheless. It wasn't enough, however, as Horus was ultimately defeated by the Emperor at the cost of the Lord of Mankind's own life. Well, kinda, just as the Cabal had foreseen. The Alpha Legion did not travel to the Eye of Terror like the other traitors, instead operating in the far east of the galaxy fulfilling their own goals. Eventually, however, the Great Scouring and the Imperium caught up with the 20th Legion, and they were brought to battle on the world of Escrador by Gilliman and the Ultramarines. Omegon, I'm just going to assume Alpharius died on Pluto from here on out, believed his legion would easily outwit and defeat the rigid and inflexible Ultramarines, and he was probably very much correct in that statement. However, Gilliman did the unthinkable, breaking his own doctrines in a surprise attack that supposedly saw Omegon slain. Maybe. The Alpha Legion have yet another trick up their sleeves, their mastery of facial transplantation and a uniform appearance. Alpharius and Omegon were the shortest of all Primarchs, and their sons were supposedly larger than other Astartes, meaning that with a bit of cosmetic work it was plausible for a Marine to pass as the Primarch. Further confounding the issue is that the Primarch was able to switch minds with his sons, as was done via librarians in the Solar War, and the fact that every Astartes identified themselves as Alpharius when asked, and the idea that a sample of blood could cause a Marine to take up the true appearance of their gene father. All this combined means that an elaborately placed duplicate for Omegon may have fought Gilliman on Escrador whilst the true Primarch lived on. But as neither Alpharius or Omegon have shown up in the past 10,000 years, I'm inclined to believe both of the twins are now dead or awaiting the psychic trigger to restore their minds as Alpharius did over Pluto. Whatever the case, the supposed loss of the Primarch did not break the Alpha Legion as Gilliman had believed, and the 20th were able to drive the Ultramarines back whilst inflicting massive casualties. Now seemingly leaderless and wishing to return to the shadows to avoid the Imperium, the Alpha Legion split into small independent warbands, which potentially was just like the good old days for the initial legionaries. They've popped up repeatedly in raids, inciting uprisings and generally causing havoc before withdrawing, and though they've learned much over the millennia, much of their tactics appear very similar to the Great Crusade. The Legion now, as far as we can tell at least, is working for chaos, as Alpharius seemingly abandoned the Cabal during the Horus Heresy, even if he didn't fall to the ruinous powers at the time. However, they're certainly not thralls of the Dark Gods in the same way as the Death Guard or Emperor's Children are, working for their own goals as much as Chaos is, even if the two are much more aligned these days. Despite repeated claims of their extinction by the High Lords of Terra, the 20th still remains active to this day in an echo of their serpentine symbol. Even if you cut off one head from a Hydra, more will grow, and the beast will keep fighting. And so, With the shadowy tale of the Alpha Legion told as best we can, let's look at a famous few individuals within the 20th Legion. Despite the fact that everyone called themselves Alpharius when asked, we know a few names and fragmented stories concerning individuals within the Alpha Legion. The first was First Captain Ingo Petch, who, like many senior officers, had received the cosmetic surgery that allowed him to impersonate his Primarch if necessary. We know he held the position during both the Crusade and Heresy era, so he may well have been part of the Alpha Legion even before the discovery of Alpharius, but given the nature of the Legion's operations, it's obvious he'll have been a skilled warrior and a flexible tactician. Unfortunately, we don't have any of his service record from that time, and thus have no proof of this. When Alpharius met the Cabal via its agent John Grammaticus, it is known that Petch, along with Omegon and the second captain Matthias Herzog, all played the role of the Primarch during the meeting or meetings, so Petch would have at least been partially aware of what the secretive organisation was asking the 20th Legion to do. Given he maintained his position in the Heresy, he must have agreed with whatever choices Primarchs made, whether as true traitors or as false ones trying to destroy chaos. Again, we don't know where Petch was or what he did during the Horus Heresy at large, but we know he was part of the force deployed to Pluto. Interestingly, given he was the first captain, he was actually not in command during the engagement. That honour was given to the Astartes who swapped minds with Alpharius, though Petch was still a senior commander in the battle. Given the Alpha Legion retreated in the aftermath of probably Alpharius' death against Dawn, it is likely that Ingo Petch survived the Horus Heresy, but as his story seemingly ends there, we cannot know for sure. Who knows? Maybe it was him who Guilliman killed on Escridor, or maybe he took command following the death of Omegon and drove the Ultramarines back before the Legion splintered apart. It's the Alpha Legion, so almost certainly we'll never get an answer, especially when you consider that all of the above questions are also applicable to second Captain Herzog as well. Good old Alpha Legion, eh? Never get anywhere. The Heroine Master was something of a unique rank within the 20th Legion, denoting the warrior in overall command of all Alpha Legion forces within a given war zone. Seeing as all Alpha Legion operations were incredibly meticulous and prone to change, becoming a Heroine Master signified not only that the warrior in question was a masterful tactician, but also hugely flexible and knowledgeable of those at his command. As a result, it was a highly prestigious position to hold within the Legion, but as ever, we know of very few. Surprisingly, it's unclear whether the first captain was in fact classified as a Heroine Master himself, though if he weren't, it would explain why he was seconded to one during the Battle of Pluto. His name was Kel Silonius, originally a member of the Headhunter kill teams that specialized in infiltration and creating chaos. The Efrit stealth squad, supposedly led by Omegon, was also believed to be one of these teams. Silonius was a favored commander, rivaling Captains Petch and Herzog in terms of Alpharius' favor, and as a probable result of this and his previous training, he was selected as the subject for Alpharius' mind swap pre-Pluto. The librarians, somehow, switched the mind of the Heroine Master with that of his Primarch, with Alpharius assuming Silonius' identity to infiltrate the Sol system, while Silonius commanded the fleet once it arrived a year or so later. It is assumed that the trigger to awaken his true personality occurred at some time during the battle, as Alpharius was definitely himself when he fought Dawn, leaving Silonius to order the retreat after the Primarch's death. He didn't actually seem fussed with what had happened, stating that all within the Legion are one, and to be fair, he kind of has a point with the whole I am Alpharius thing, and the probable knowledge of Omegon's existence too. The other known Heroine Master was Armalus Dynat, or at least that's what we think his name was. Some claim it to be false, constructed, rather than given. He first appeared in the logs of the Ultramarines sometime after the Battle of Asana Bay, that we sadly know nothing about, supposedly sparring, physically or verbally is unknown, with Ultramarine First Master Marius Gage. It is believed he was one of the commanders during the infamous Testra compliance we discussed earlier. This is unconfirmed, but given he'd already had some sort of dealings with the 13th Legion, it wouldn't surprise me if he was involved. Dynat of course joined his Primarch in their betrayal, and was in probable overall command during the invasion and battle for the world of Paramar 5. Toward the north of Segmentum Solar, Paramar presented Horus with a straight shot between Istvan and Terra, and thus the War Master ordered it taken. The world was defended by both Mechanicum forces and a loyalist contingent of Iron Warriors led by the warsmith Kirvalen, who were ignorant of Perturabo's fall, and though the Dark Mechanicum and Alpha Legion made good progress, they were nearly stopped for a time. Eventually, however, Paramar 5 fell fully under traitor control, and despite a counter-invasion, it remained in Horus's hands until it finally rejoined the Imperium during the Great Scouring. As for Dynat, well, he falls off the grid following Paramar. One assumes he was at Pluto or orchestrating some other vital operation neither Alpharius or Omegon could attend to, but unfortunately, no data available. If you're sick of me saying that at this point, don't worry, I am too. A middle command rank across the Legion Astartes was the Delegatus, sometimes known as the Consul Delegatus. They had a great degree of independence and trust, as they were often tasked with specific missions and given total authority in conducting them. Very few individuals were known to be Delegatus, but the Alpha Legion had one, Ortolan Score, a name that viewers of previous episodes should potentially recognise. Score was perhaps one of the most famous individuals in the 20th Legion, as his name had been commended to the War Council on at least 7 occasions. This council included all the big names in the Crusade era Imperium: the Emperor, all the Primarchs, Malcador the Sigillite, Kelbor Hal of the Mechanicum, Constantine Valdor of the Custodes. Initially, i.e. pre-Eleanor, the War Council practically ran the entire Imperium, but post-Eleanor it was for military purposes only, as the Emperor no longer led it with Horus's ascension to War Master. That Score was commended to these individuals on 7 separate occasions for his outstanding performance speaks volumes on his ability as a commander. Honestly, I'm surprised he isn't a Heroine Master, or maybe we just don't know about it. When the Horus Heresy was revealed, he is believed to have been active in bringing worlds under Horus's banner, but unfortunately for Score, his most notable engagement was a massive failure. Score was charged with overseeing the sieges of Epsilon Stranivar 9 and then Mozoa as part of the Battle of the Coronate Deeps, a campaign that became a grinding stalemate despite both Horus and Mortarion being present. His Alpha Legion force was working alongside Iron Warriors and Death Guard, and it's known that the Iron Warriors in particular were treated horrendously. Most notably, Score and the Death Guard both abandoned the Iron Warriors when the final assault failed on Epsilon Stranivar 9, causing them to take horrendous casualties that their commander Narek Drager swore to avenge. When the pair were tasked with taking Mozoa, they obviously didn't get on, and ultimately Score's patience for the siege ran out as he wished to join the push to Terra. Thus the attack was rushed, and the Iron Warriors were again committed to a costly assault, whilst the Alpha Legion were operating elsewhere. Cassian Dracos, former Legion Master of the Salamanders and now a Dreadnought, convinced the Iron Warriors to defect back to the Loyalist side, and Score's forces were overwhelmed by the combined assault. Score was able to escape, but he lost an arm to Salamander Captain Xaiaphas Jur in the process. What became of the Delegatus following Mozoa is unknown, but I suspect his standing within the Legion would have dropped significantly after his costly, stupid mistakes. Unfortunately, his tale ends abruptly at that point, but if his fate is as I suspect, he may well have been part of the force on Pluto, but in a non-commanding role. We will conclude our look at the Alpha Legion with some shorter tales, mainly because there are no other full stories to tell from this secretive bunch of Astartes. The first is Focron, the designation for a headhunter prime within the Legion. This meant he was one of the leaders of those elite infiltration teams, though whether he was their overall commander or not by the prime designation is unclear due to the fact that Omegon headed one of his own teams. Focron wasn't really involved much with the Crusade or the Heresy, as he was interred in stasis beneath Terra itself years before the rebellion even began, though pre or post Cabal, not so sure. He and his team were then activated when Alpharius arrived in the Sol system under Silonius' identity, and alongside their Primarch they caused all sorts of havoc before the Alpha Legion arrived. He was supposedly killed at a place called Artifact 9 Kappa Mu between Terra and Venus, but later a Chaos Lord using that title caused trouble for the Imperium again. After a long Inquisition investigation, it was revealed that Focron was basically just a title or an alias used by many Alpha Legion agents, implying that the original bearer of the designation was actually dead. The next is that of Sheed Ranko, leader of the Alpha Legion's elite Terminators and at least occasionally Alpharius' bodyguards, the Lernaean. These warriors were practically unknown to the wider Imperium, as just like the pre-Alpharius Legion, they were known to leave no witnesses. Sheed did not survive the Horus Heresy, as he was given a critical mission by Omegon that we've discussed earlier. He was charged with the destruction of the Tenebrae installation by Omegon, and whilst it was a one-way suicide mission, it was this act that allowed Rogel Dawn's messages to reach the White Scars, pronunciation. Omegon's justification was that Tenebrae was leaking information to the enemies of the Legion. Whilst this may have been true, the timing of the mission does raise questions as to Omegon's stance on things, like I mentioned a little earlier. We don't know who assumed leadership of the Lernaean following Ranko's death at Tenebrae, but it is known that Alpharius impersonated one of them in the Alaxes Nebula to confound the Space Wolves, so maybe their leader took his place in the battle? As ever with the Alpha Legion, we will likely never know. Finally, there is Exodus, just a title unsurprisingly. He was probably the best sniper in the entire Legion Astartes, with an accuracy record supposedly on a level with a Vindicare assassin. Yeesh. Unfortunately, we don't know of any particular engagements he fought in, but it is said that he could end a war with a single shot before the war even started, and I wanted to note his existence simply due to his ability, which, quite frankly, if you know anything about the Assassinorium, is absolutely ridiculous. So end the tales of the Alpha Legion. Such a shadowy force may not have as detailed a history or as well-known individuals as the other Legiones Astartes, but they were undoubtedly incredibly skilled and dangerous in equal measure. Whilst the exact history of Alpharius, Omegon and their sons is shrouded in falsehoods and mystery, one cannot deny that they conducted their operations with an ability I doubt any Space Marine could hope to match. Honestly, I was so worried I wouldn't be able to find enough information to create this record, but I found the story of the Alpha Legion to be worthy of my respect for their martial prowess and their flexibility in war. But for now, we must continue our journey. Next time, we'll be looking at another Astartes group, one that in some ways bears potential similarity to the Alpha Legion, if you believe they didn't fall to chaos anyway. This one, however, was much more open in its actions and is now close to, if not totally, extinct. Thank you all for watching. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.